director of the Valley Fever Center for Excellence, and it's my pleasure to introduce our medical grand round speaker today, David Archer. It's actually also the 23rd annual Farness Lecture that's sponsored by our center. This is being done as part of the 16th annual Valley Fever Awareness Week, which you'll notice was November 10th through 18th. But we have a very expansive concept of what a week is. So this is really part of that week. And it's really appropriate that we focus once a year on this disease and have a center actually for this. This is, of course, an Arizonan's view of the United States, but it really fits for this disease because 2/3 of all cocci infections in the United States occur in Arizona. So we deserve to try to do something about it. This lecture is named after Orrin J. Farness, who in 1938 published a paper entitled A Case of Fungus Coccidioides Infection, Primary in the Lung with Cavity Formation and Healing. And this was the first culture-proven case of valley fever in Arizona. He is a very distinguished Tucson physician. He passed away in 1970, and in 1975, a lectureship was established in his name as part of the Arizona Chest Disease Symposium, and that continued through 1991 when the series was discontinued. And then in 1996, when we established our Valley Fever Center, we started it again and have continued it to now as part of our Valley Fever Awareness annual arrangements. So David Archer grew up in Illinois and went to the local school there in Urbana, the University of Illinois, where he got his bachelor's and his master's degree in computer engineering and electrical engineering. He then worked for a while and then moved to the West Coast, got his PhD at Portland State University in computer science. Since then, he has been one of the principal scientists, or maybe the principal scientist? One of them. There's lots of them in Galois Incorporated in Portland. And his research projects focus on things like homomorphic encryption, cryptographic program obfuscation, and provenance of computation. Now, you all, by your faces, can see the obvious relationships to bedside medicine from those topics. Why are we actually addressing that in the Valley Fever Week Farness Lecture? Well, it turns out that this summer, some Congress people submitted legislation, introduced possible legislation, which would in fact involve blockchain technology and cryptography into helping with fungal infection research, and in particular cocci research. So that's the link which got me saying, what the heck is this all about? And led to meeting David and having a delightful time last night and for the better part of this morning. So his topic today will be Keep It Secret, Keep It Safe, Cryptographic Tools for Electronic Medical Record Security. And it's my pleasure to introduce David Archer. Thank you.
John, thanks very much for the kind introduction. So indeed, the title of my talk is Keep It Secret, Keep It Safe, Cryptographic Tools for EMR Security, but I want to unpack that just a little bit at a time. First, we're going to consider the following question: why you should never, ever trust software engineers to keep health data private from the armies of Mordor. So science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's his third law. So by that measure, the rings of power turn out to be a great example of technology. Right? And the wizards of the third age of Middle-earth are what we here in this fourth age first called philosophers, from the Greek called lovers of wisdom, and today we call software nerds. Today, for example, Radagast the Brown is Radagast the mobile app developer. And this guy, CTO at Facebook. So, the wisest of Middle-earth did a fabulous job of engineering those 19 rings of power. We'll leave the 20th one out for the moment. From a functional requirements perspective. They're an excellent example of designing modern technology. So, for example, they looked at these important requirements. Embody the strength and will to govern. That's right out of the movie. and out of the book. Grant vision from afar, imbue wisdom and long life, look good with chainmail. All those are really important requirements for the rings of power. But they forgot to talk about the negative requirements, the things that we don't want the rings of power to do. So we have some of those here on the board that we should talk about that they forgot. Not cause wearer to be enthralled to an evil overlord. So in information security, cybersecurity, we call it the data integrity property. Not make you reveal your secrets to the armies of Mordor, we call that the data privacy aspect of information security. And we can't forget not cause psychotic episodes of eldritch power, for which we don't really have a name in information security yet. So those are the negative requirements, and it makes you wonder, why didn't they think about those things? Was the reason that the elves were in too much of a hurry to get Ring of Power version 1.0 out for the Christmas rush? It could be that I'm mixing up my elves there. I'm sure that they, in any case, thought what all good software developers think as they watch their code ship to thousands of eager customers. They think, what could possibly go wrong? And it actually took me over 13 months to read the answer to that to my children as a bedtime story, one long bedtime story of 4 books. But let's move our focus to today, the fourth age of Middle-earth, after the last of the white ships left for the Undying Lands. What about wizards besides software engineers, software nerds? Let's consider what if the wizards called civil engineers on the right there, on the left there rather, were the kind of people who did their job the way that software engineers like these guys do their jobs. So what if bridges were built the way that we engineer software? So let me animate this story. So our design engineer designs his software and says, there, it compiles. That road's probably wide enough to carry a car or two. Hey, I ran some basic tests. I'm sure that's ready to ship. Let's ship it. And then the validation engineer comes along. He's an important part of the software team. He says, hey, wait a minute. I've got to test this in case you screwed up somehow. Let's drive a truck across the bridge and see if it holds up. Our next character is the coroner, who says, cause of death, blunt force trauma, to wit, by a collapsing bridge. So the coroner exits the scene, and the product manager shows up and says, hey, hurry up, we have to ship this next week. So the design engineer does what all good software designers do. He says, I can fix that bug. There, it's done, ship it. What could possibly go wrong? So in this analogy between software and bridge building, it's an interesting comparison. It was first done in 1986. And you can ask, why do I bring this up? It's not that this analogy is so interesting or funny necessarily, but it's that the analogy has been attacked over and over by software people. And so it's in those attacks that we actually learn something about the deeper problems here, with security particularly. One quote that's of interest is this one. I don't think bridge building has anything in common with software. It's a specious comparison. Software is only like bridge building if you're building a bridge on Jupiter out of newly invented materials and constructed out of equipment that didn't exist 5 years ago. So my question is the following. If you reason that way and you know those things are true, then why wouldn't you study the physics of Jupiter? Why wouldn't you understand the new materials? And why wouldn't you figure out how your equipment works first? So this guy is in way too much of a hurry to ship it and wonder what could possibly go wrong. Another interesting quote that gives us some viewpoint on the way that software engineers look at these problems says this: if I want 2 bridges, I'll engineer and build two bridges. If I want 2 copies of Windows XP, I only need to engineer it once, and I can then make infinite perfect copies. This is so very wrong, it's hard to point out all the ways it's wrong. But the key point is that it's actually those millions of copies of not perfect, but incredibly buggy copies of the software that's the entire opportunity for the malware industry and the problem of security and privacy today. So the good news for all of us is that what? Civil engineers don't work this way, right? They prove using math that the bridge will stand up before they ever fire up a backhoe, much less drive a truck across it. And they also think about those negative requirements. Bridge shall not fall down under wind load. Well, okay, that happened once in Washington State, but it doesn't happen often. But in contrast, for the rings of power, we usually don't think about negative requirements. And often we don't even understand how the technology works. Yet we rush to ship it, and other users rush to adopt it. So let's think about another example, this example we call machine learning technology. Nobody actually understands how machine learning works. The scientists who develop it do not understand how machine learning works. If they ask you, how did this machine learning engine make that conclusion, they can't tell you. James Mickens, who's a computer science professor at Harvard, accurately describes machine learning as the computer science equivalent of the egg drop project. You know, go out there, try a bunch of random things, find something that works eventually, that you can drop the egg 20 feet without breaking it, and then rush to use it again, even though we don't understand it. And even then, what we do is we take this kind of inscrutable power we've developed. Hey, it seems to work. We don't know why. And then we connect it to important things. We trust machine learning to decide clemency and jail sentencing. We trust it to decide who gets loans and who doesn't. We trust it to classify weapons targets for weapons systems. So machine learning is a great example of, hey, it appears to work. We don't know why. We don't know what the security issues are, but we ship it and use it anyway. The Internet of Things is another example. Let's look at a few things from just this year in the Internet of Things. We saw this happen back in June, where Internet of Things cloud pets were leaking information, children's voice information, to the Internet at large. Not quite what you want out of a toy. There's that negative requirement, shall not leak everything my child says to the Internet. We should have thought about that first. Another one, just recently, finding that some big construction cranes are actually vulnerable to simple attacks on unprotected protocols. So the negative approach of guy driving by in the Ford can't actually control my huge crane and drop things on people wasn't really considered. More close to home, in August, the notion that medical devices have vulnerabilities, and there are many of them, that allow hackers to falsify vital measurements. All those things are part of the Internet of Things, another place where we're actually rushing a huge hurry to get billions of devices, literally by 2020, something like 30 billion devices attached to the Internet, none of which have a security standard protocol. So again, an example of how you shouldn't really trust software engineers to take care of security for you. So one question that's interesting to ask is, why are computer science and software development the way they are? And one answer that's sort of specious is because the race of computer science professors and software engineers, above all else, desire power. But we'll skip that. We'll move on. The idea is the same, though. We're in a rush to ship things. We should probably think a little more carefully. So if you couple that desire for power with the fact that most of us nerds have no social skills at all, yet we need constant stimulation to keep our ADD minds occupied, then it follows that we sit in front of computers all day and all night, which follows then that we've never read a history book. And since we're all in their 20s, you can tell I'm in my 20s, we have no real-world experience either. So we tend to rush from crazy new idea to ship it without ever filtering it through real-world experience or history books. And that, in technology speak in Silicon Valley, is called, and in Elvish, is called disruptive innovation. So there it is. That's the dark secret. That's the end of the first part of my talk. Software engineers and computer scientists are really bad at what we do, and we're bad at it for bad reasons. Okay, let's set that aside. Let's talk about why do we need security anyway. So in December of 1890, these two guys, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, argued for protecting all persons from having matters which they may properly prefer to keep private made public against their will. And those are pretty strong words for a legal journal in 1890. So what was it, do you think, that they were worried about in terms of privacy and security at that point in time? What came about that made them so nervous and ask for laws? It was this. The instantaneous camera, the idea that anybody could carry a camera around now and take a picture of you when you didn't know it and could publish that picture anywhere. That was a huge danger to privacy in 1890. So today, things are different. You know that. Today, our private information is currency. We actually spend our private information in exchange for services, and others steal it, and they trade it and use it against us. So on one hand, we've stepped from here all the way back to the mid-1700s. At that point, Jean de la Bruyere wrote, "All confidence placed in another is dangerous if it's not perfect." And maybe more apropos, Benjamin Franklin, in Poor Richard's Almanac in 1735, just after he had founded the first domestic fire department, first community fire department, said 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. It's the best statement on privacy I've ever found. I use it all the time. But today we're not really talking about just any information. We're talking more about patient data that might be stored in Cerner, Epic, or other EMR systems. Those electronic healthcare records are making healthcare hacking far easier. In fact, you can see the rise of systems like that in the past few years. You can also look at this chart, which shows the rise of healthcare hacking incidents in the last few years. There's definitely a correlation. Electronic medical records, easier to steal medical information. So why do we care? Well, it turns out that stolen medical records are huge business. They support fraud. They support providing critical information like social security numbers and dates of birth to people who would do bad things. So for example, maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. Anybody know what this is? This is a darknet sales page. If you go to sites that end in .onion, you can find these things. This is a place where you can buy and sell things that people can't legally buy and sell. In this case, what we have is medical records for $6.24 a piece of children stolen from a pediatrician's office, born in years 1997 to 2010. Most of them come, it says, with from good families that can provide medical support. There's the rest of this ad that talks about you can also get mother's maiden names and so on. Why? Why do people want to steal children's medical records? Any ideas? It's because children have perfect credit and are great targets for fraud. How about this one? Another real darknet sales page. For $2 a piece in quantities of 100, medical records. Fresh medical database, 140 million records. Each record has name, social security number, address, birth date, gender, insurance, and there's even a death date record for 60,000 records there. That commands a premium. Why? Why would we want to have medical records for people who have died?
Change your ID to somebody who's dead.
Pretty much the case. It's because dead people tend not to notice when you misuse their credit. Yep. So this is why it's big business. So let me catch up to myself here. The bottom line here is that, about 3 million medical records have been breached. And I say that in a context. The context is in 3 months of this year, 3 million medical records have been breached, stolen, sold on the black market. So we should care about security. So let me pose an exercise to you. We have this kind of theft going on. This kind of stuff is available for purchase on the market. What do you think happens when we combine loss of privacy on a massive scale with machine learning that we talked about before, that we don't know how it works, and negative requirements that we forget? Think about that as homework. The interesting question is, before you answer, remember that we don't understand how machine learning works, so there's no way to take anybody to court about it. Interesting concept. So that's part 2 of the talk. Why do we care about security? We certainly should. It's not necessarily about why should a medical record be hard to share with someone else who should see it. It's all about those records being used for nefarious purposes like fraud. Okay, part 3. Well, then, if we're so worried about security, why would we want to share data anyway? We could just lock the data in a safe and dump it in an ocean. But it turns out that sharing actually has benefits. The trick is to gain those benefits without giving up privacy in some way that can be used against us. So obviously sharing data with traditional diagnosticians, specialists, and pharmacists, well, that has a direct impact on quality of care. We should keep doing that. In billing, this is also important. Sharing data is necessary for payments, for insurance claims, for adjudications. We have to do that. In clinical research, sharing data about trial outcomes leads to go-no decisions on new therapies and improving care. Less obviously, maybe, sharing data among clinical trials can prevent people from signing on to multiple trials and thus, harming the value of the research that comes out of those trials. In longitudinal research, we can also see that sharing data leads to understanding correlation between standards of care and outcomes, and that leads to better standards of care. So we see the value of sharing in other domains beside medicine as well. Coordinating disaster relief among multinational military coalitions is a key issue. But at the same time, there's data those military coalitions don't want to share. They may not want to share, for example, exactly where my ships are or exactly how many people are on them, but they might be willing to share within a certain uncertainty. Here's where my ships are, and maybe here's how much fresh water they can produce every day. So it's sharing some data, keeping other data private. The same is true in medicine. Interagency sharing in government about public services to decide how to allocate scarce resources. For example, would you want to share jail and incarceration data and public mental health services data to answer questions like, to what extent are people who are incarcerated taking advantage of mental health services? Those things could be very, very valuable in order to tune expenditure at county level, let's say, to making good in the public sphere. And finally, I'll bring up one more example, providing information to prospective students about how likely they are to have student loans, what those loan balances might be, how long will it take to graduate, given where they want to go to school and what their major would want to be. So this kind of system where you might pull data from the Bureau of Census, who understands things like family size and disability and employment data, from the IRS, who understands income, from the Federal Student Aid Group that understands student loans and grants and so on, from the Students' Clearinghouse that understands institutions and how long it takes to get degrees there. All of those things fit into answering those questions that college students want to know before they choose what college or medical school they're going to attend. So should we share that data to enable them to see just those outcomes so they can make a wise decision? Probably so. And finally, one more example about sharing data, and this is what I'm particularly proud of, is Callisto. I don't know whether you've heard of Callisto or not. They make it their mission to enable victims of sexual assault and harassment to come forward and find pathways to justice while absolutely protecting their data and the truth about their incidents, and in fact, it has to be done, protect the information about their perpetrators. All that information has to be protected, yet we have to enable people seeking justice for what's happened. Now, Callisto is a nonprofit, and my engagement with them is a non-paid one, so there's no conflict of interest for me to talk about them. In their new product, they just launched a product a few weeks ago, they approach this problem of protecting victim and perpetrator information through very comprehensive use of encryption technology. So it's of the form where a user logging into the system can't be traced back and identified. So there's no tie between a person and their use of the system. The information they report, when an incident happened, what happened, who it was that perpetrated that incident, all that information is encrypted from before it leaves the user's computer until eventually it's decrypted only by an attorney. And in fact, the data is never decrypted by this company called Callisto. That's interesting because now even a subpoena can't require them to reveal this data because they have no decryption keys. And further, even the lawyers, nobody in the world can decrypt the information about somebody's experience, somebody's harassment or sexual assault experience, until more than one person names the same perpetrator. Why is that? It's because they're taking advantage of two interesting facts. Perpetrators of sexual assault tend to be serial. And they tend to assault about 6 people during, let's say, a college career, if you're talking about college perpetrators. The other fact is that people are much more willing to come forward if they know they're not the only one. They know they won't be just turned away by people saying, that didn't happen, that couldn't possibly have happened. There's strength in numbers. So we designed them a crypto system that keeps that information private. It can never be decrypted with any key until 2 different people name the same perpetrator. And then, only then, can a lawyer assigned to the case decrypt the information. It's an interesting approach, but it's one that's very definitely aimed at sharing information when appropriate and keeping that information inviolably private when it's not. So, that's the end of part 3. Why do we care about sharing anyway? Let's talk about tools for privacy assurance. And eventually, yes, I'll get on to blockchains. Eventually. So in the remainder of the talk, I'd like to share a bit about some of the problems with current methods for balancing these disparate goals of sharing and security. And then it'll describe some emerging technologies, things like secure computation, where we can actually compute on data while it stays encrypted, and blockchains and how they do or don't fit into this story. First, one thing I want to say is that there's really little short-term actionable advice I can offer you about how to both assure privacy and subdue this sort of monster of paperwork and delay that makes it a daily hell to deal with HIPAA. That kind of thing is something you probably have relatively little choice about, and changing it will take, months to years, probably years. First, we'd have to develop new policies. We'd have to argue those back and forth. We'd have to file them in triplicate, lose them, find them, bury them in soft peat for 3 months. No, wait, that's from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I forgot. That's not Lord of the Rings. My bad. After we do all that and agree on what we want to do, then we have to develop the software. And we already talked about the problems of developing good software. But I can offer this. I can offer you a quick sort of 6-point guide about how to interact with the electronic world and how to protect the systems that you have personal influence over. And that looks like this. First of all, and you may have seen these 100 times, and the reason that these 6 come to the top is that these are the ones that are effective. First of all, if you have a computer, a pad, an Apple Watch, an iPhone, any of those things, whenever you find out that there's a patch available, take a minute and just do it. Most of the current breaks in computer security happen because people don't patch. The patch is maybe a month old now and somebody hasn't patched their system. That leaks 15 million credit card numbers. That kind of thing is what really happens. So patching, as soon as you know, is a valuable thing. Never ever click, never ever click a link in an email, any email, even one that comes from somebody you think you know. Just don't do it. Copy the link out, manually type it in. There are services where you can check it out before you ever access it. Just don't do it. It's very dangerous because what happens is those links often lead to download sites where viruses get downloaded to whatever platform you're on, and then all your data is in the clear. Along those lines, you should assume, frankly, that any email you get that's not a continuing part of a conversation could be malicious. Right? Current mechanisms involve cyber criminals breaking in by phishing, right? You've seen the phishing kind of emails. They may look official. They say, click this link to find out about your subpoena to appear in court. That's not a subpoena to appear in court. That's a download site for a Trojan. Okay, once that happens, and those things are easily sort of defendable against by number 2 there, then those people are inside the network. Now they can send mail from real accounts that look very realistic. If those are new emails, not part of a continuing discussion you're having, now suddenly that's a vector for infection. So assume that any email that's not a continuing conversation might be infected. Passwords. Everybody talks about the strength of passwords. Don't try to remember them, because if you try to remember them, you start reusing them. Use a password safe. There are a bunch out there. LastPass is an example. Use strong passwords. Use unique passwords for every account you have. And finally, where you can get the option from whoever's providing the service, use what's called 2-factor authentication. Your password plus your phone. They may text a code to your phone, you type it in. You may use a Google Authenticator and type in a number. You may have an RSA key fob. Always, always depend on a second factor that's not hackable by a man-in-the-middle, what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. When you're using an untrusted Wi-Fi, everybody here I'm sure travels a good deal. If you're at hotels, airports, coffee shops, it costs about $3 a month to get a virtual private network software. You download this application, you pay $3 a month, you can pay it annually, and then all of your traffic is encrypted on your device and not decrypted until it reaches a secure server somewhere on the internet. So that big gap called the Wi-Fi in the coffee shop, where everybody is trying to scam you and gather your information, can be closed instantly. Just a good practice. And finally, encrypt your email. Encryption seems so esoteric, seems so hard to use. It's really not. You can pick up, if you use Gmail, who here uses Google Mail? Yeah. If you use Gmail, there's a real simple service called Virtru, V-I-R-T-R-U. Again, I have no relation to them. But they're a great service. It works well with Gmail. You can just simply slide the slider switch and your transmissions are encrypted from then on. Easy to do. So this is something that's worth looking at. If you're not familiar with these things, and hopefully most of you are, but if not, take a look at those. They may be useful. The thing that will really bake your noodle later on is there are sites that let you type in your password and tell you how strong your password is it safe. They're great sites. The thing to bake your noodle is is it safe for me to type my password into the site so they can tell me whether it's secure or not? So think about that offline. Another thing you can do is to quiz your IT service providers, right? Make them think about their security stance. Make them think that you know, and make them know that you care about security. There are a bunch of questions, and I won't go over all of them here. I'll hit on a couple that you can ask, and there are really simple answers. They're yes or no answers that tell you whether they're doing the right job in protecting information where you don't have direct control. So the obvious one is, do they encrypt all the data they hold when it's at rest on their servers? There's only one answer. The answer is it's got to be yes. If not, you're in serious trouble. Do they encrypt all data transmission using the same strong encryption? Again, the answer has to be yes. They should be using virtual private network technology everywhere. Do they require this kind of multi-factor authentication I talked to you about a minute ago for all their people, even when they're inside their network? The answer has to be yes, or they're in serious trouble. And there are others, like maintaining current inventories of what hardware and software is on the network, keeping all the patches up to date. But these 7 questions are good ones to take to your service providers and ask them, are you doing these? If you're not, we need to talk, because you're not protecting data the way it needs to be protected. So let me move on to part 5, which is about current methods in data security and some of their shortfalls. Today, we really have a few ways that we tend to protect data that we want to share. And we already know it's valuable to share it, and it's important to protect it. One is contractual agreements. It's awfully easy to say, I'll give you this data so long as you sign this contract that says you won't give it to anyone else. Now, who here thinks that's a viable way of protecting data? Any thoughts, especially given the questions we just looked at? Probably not. Contractual agreements are fine, but the contract inevitably says, when I'm done, I'll delete all copies. Is that even possible? Is it even possible to know? The answer is no. So we shouldn't really be depending on contract law or cyber insurance either for protecting data. What's cyber insurance about? It's a simple idea. If you're a big company, unfortunately, you can only get cyber insurance if you're like $2.5 billion and up. Then you can buy insurance that says if I get hacked, they will cover the costs of repairing the hack, of compensating people whose data was stolen. The problem is that under $2.5 billion in company size, there's a lot of companies, and they can't get cyber insurance. Plus, really, insurance instead of protecting stuff in the first place? That's like buying car insurance and then going out and driving as fast as we can. Not a smart idea. So let's set those aside. There are other mechanisms here. De-identification is one I'm sure you've heard of in medical research, among others. We tend to de-identify data by taking out identifiers such as names, or by substituting some meaningless value for names and so on. But there are significant problems with de-identification. The most important problem is that it's not workable. There are paper after paper after paper in the research literature in computer science that shows that you can reconstruct de-identified data easily. You can recover it all. Everything from 20 years ago, when a researcher at Harvard actually published the first paper and said, you know, so long as I know simply a date of birth, a gender, and a zip code, I can provably identify that down to a single individual over 80% of the time in the US. That's the beginning of de-identification not being useful. The end is more recently, when you saw, just last year or the year before, the hacks against the Netflix challenge, where given a database of what how people rated movies and some other information that people could get at, people were able to re-identify and attach names to Netflix accounts by the thousands. Now, you don't think of that data as being re-identifiable, but it is. De-identification doesn't work in general, and so shouldn't be trusted in general. Besides, well, let me go on. Synthetic data is another approach. We take data, we say, we'll model that data. We'll create another data set with totally false identifiers, and we'll model the data, we'll model the statistical relationships. Is that useful for medical research? I would claim no. Why? Because the patterns, the correlations that are in the synthetic data are exactly the ones that the data manipulator knew about And none of the ones that they didn't know about were probably copied over. So the correlations you're searching for to find new insights are probably not there. So is de-identification and synthetic data, are they going to continue to be used? Yes, because there are not a lot of other options at the moment, but be aware of the weaknesses, both in terms of privacy and utility of those approaches. Differential privacy, who has heard of differential privacy out there? So this is a more modern approach to protecting data in databases. If you're computing statistics, like averages, let's say, let's take a simple one, an average, but it could extend to regressions through machine learning. If you take a database and compute a statistic over the database, differential privacy is an approach that says, I can add to that average answer just enough noise so that you can't identify any single entry in the database, but yet the data is still utilizable enough for your research, it's valid for your research. So this notion of differential privacy is starting to replace synthetic data and de-identification for statistical quantities anyway. And that's something that's worth looking into if you're in the space of doing statistical research. You should talk to someone who knows about differential privacy. Okay, so that's sort of the approaches today, and the last one is an emerging approach. Let me move on and talk a bit about other approaches and how it started that I actually got here today. The Forward Act, which I think John mentioned, is legislation by McCarthy and Schweikert and a few others towards supporting research in valley fever, but part of it is also supporting research of modern crypto technologies for use in research, in medical research. And so part of the bill, which hasn't passed, and as bills are, may never pass, still requires that, at least last time I saw it, requires that National Institutes of Health fund a prototype of a system like this one, where many hospitals could share data but keep it encrypted, allowing a researcher to ask questions of that data and learn answers but never see the original data. There are several techniques to do this. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but that's how things got started. And that began with interest in blockchain technologies, strangely enough, by Representative Schweikert and what's called the Blockchain Caucus in Congress. So this is where we got started. But now I'm going to set that aside even and talk about blockchains, because I know you're just dying to hear about what's a blockchain anyway. Who here understands blockchains? Well, you can do this if you want. A blockchain is really simply three constructs linked together. It's the notion of distributed storage. That is, I may have many servers, and each one holds a copy of my information, so that no one server can lose my data. That seems like a good idea. But there are problems with that, because we have to make sure that everybody has a common view of the data. So a second part of a blockchain is a distributed program. And it's a program that all those holders of the data run on the data when they get it, and they store some derivative. Now that program may be as simple as just store the data, thank you, or it may be what's called a smart contract. And that's a program that all those nodes run, and it advances the state of some kind of agreement. It may be that a step in a protocol has now been followed, and somebody's saying, yes, I finished that step, on to the next one. But smart contracts are the idea that you can negotiate contractual constructs, right, using technology instead of contracts and lawyers. First of all, it's a terrible idea, because frankly, contracts get negotiated by real people. We have a court system that lets you negotiate. What does this mean? What's the intent here? What should be done? A smart contract is fixed at inception, can't be changed without major overhaul to the blockchain involved, and it leaves you with, sort of, in some sense, a Procrustean bed of contract. You can't change it, you can't alter it. It is what it is. But that's what these distributed programs are. They're contracts of a sort. And the third part of what's a blockchain is an agreement protocol. Why? Because these 100 or more servers who are keeping track of the data and running these distributed programs, well, they have to be able to agree on what they saw and in what order. So that's the three pieces of a blockchain. You combine those three, you have a piece of technology that's very complicated, but may do the job you want. Let's talk for a minute about blockchains and how they process and store data, and then we'll talk a minute about how they recall data so you can get at it. There's been a lot of talk about blockchains being good for privacy of things like medical records. I hear those words, and they're all in the same sentence, but they don't make any sense. In fact, blockchains are just the opposite. Right? Blockchains are a way of making data available to everyone. Some blockchains attempt to then twist themselves into pretzels to then turn around and keep the data private again. Arguable and really complicated. So blockchains are not about privacy, first of all. But how do blockchains work? They work sort of like this. A user who wants to record something. This could be as little as a transaction in Bitcoin or some step in a smart contract or just store some data for me. The user is working with these hundreds or tens or thousands even of servers who are the participants in the blockchain, the storers of data. The user broadcasts to some number of them the thing that's of interest. I want to store this. I want to add this to my contract. Fine, that's easy enough. We know how to do broadcasting information on the internet. The next step then is that all of these servers run that distributed program I talked about. They got the data, they run the program, they know what the change needs to be to the blockchain. And by the way, you should think of a blockchain as a ledger, if you will, just a place to write things down. These distributed programs figure out what is it that should go on the chain. So that gets computed, and then typically all of those same servers try to solve a really hard math problem. Why is that? Why would we care that they spend time and energy solving a math problem? It's because we don't want one to win all the time. We don't want the biggest machine to always win, because if you win all the time, you get to control what goes on the blockchain. And you can cheat, and you can write anything you want, regardless of what was supposed to be written. The premise here is that there's honesty among those 1,000 servers. And so by making them all solve a really hard problem, they're going to somehow equally distribute who wins. Once one of them wins, then they can simply say, here's my solution to the problem. I've got this. Here's what the new thing to put on the blockchain ledger looks like. So they then take this new transaction for the chain and they broadcast it to all the other servers. All the other servers check to make sure that it was correct. They check the answer to the hard math problem to make sure that the guy wasn't lying. And they check that the transaction is valid. And then they write it, all of them, onto the blockchain. And we're done with writing a transaction. So that's exactly how blockchains work. There are some variations, permissions versus permissionless and so on. But in general, that's how blockchains work. So you can think of this as nothing more than a distributed way of writing things down that keeps itself consistent and doesn't let any one player win all the time and cheat because of that. Okay. Now, reading from blockchains is a much simpler deal because I don't have to worry about distributed consensus protocols and running these smart contracts and keeping them all in sync. For reading from blockchains, it's pretty simple. I can pick one or more of those 1,000 agents at random. I can read the chunk of the blockchain that I care about. I have some identifier that tells me which one it is. I can compare all those answers to make sure they're all the same. And I say, got it. I know now what I had stored on the blockchain. Again, it's like a distributed database. Okay. So let me catch up to myself again. The features that you get from a blockchain are roughly the following things. It's ordering, like we talked about, agreement of all those players about what order did things happen in. Did somebody deposit money to their Bitcoin account before they spent it? Things like that. Immutability, that is, the record's permanent. It can't be altered just by anyone saying they want to alter it. Transparency, the data is available to any interested party, which we'll find out quickly we don't really want in the first place. There's the notion of pseudonymity. In some blockchains, I don't have to say who I am. I don't have to register with a bank or a central authority. I can merely say, here's a number that represents me, call it my account number. I'm not going to tell you who I am. Here's the transaction I want to conduct. And that's exactly how Bitcoin works. It's not anonymous. It's pseudonymous. You have a pseudonym, your account number, and it's not linked to your personal identity. So it's hard to link those two. Yet it's relatively easy, or somewhat easy, for law enforcement to track transaction histories by looking at the account numbers and track down, and from that and other data, identify people. The notion of trust neutrality, that no one party really needs to be trusted. I have to trust some coalition of all these players out there. And by the way, that seems like a bad idea. I'm trusting 1,000 servers I don't really know and don't own. let me think, to store data on my behalf without any evidence they do it right aside from this protocol that I might believe in. That seems a little tough. And then just the one good, valuable piece is this decentralized storage, this notion that I've got many copies of my data, it's really hard to destroy them all. So 6 key features, but also blockchains have drawbacks. They don't scale. For example, today, Visa can process, what, about 25,000 transactions a second. PayPal, if you use PayPal, can process about 200 per second. Bitcoin can process about 7, maybe. And Ethereum, which is another Bitcoin-like thing that has more complex smart contracts, can process about 20. That doesn't seem scalable to me, given that you're already using thousands of CPUs to do the job. They don't scale from a power perspective. It takes, right now, about 6.8 million US households worth of electricity to power Bitcoin. That seems a little excessive, that I can power 7 million households for what I'm spending to run a small corner currency that's often used for things that aren't quite genuine transactions, where I would claim they are. So it doesn't scale for a couple of different reasons. Second of all, blockchains are complicated. We just went through that. How do you write a blockchain? That seems complicated as opposed to, hey, database, here's my data, store it, please. It's done. And because it's complicated, think about part 1 of my talk about how you should never trust software engineers for security or getting things right. Blockchains have defects. It turns out we don't want immutability either. We don't want a permanent record. We want to be able to delete things. We want to be forgotten. There's in GDPR, which is about 55,000 words of interesting text, some of which have loopholes for privacy. Still, it's a good start, and one of the key provisions is the right to be forgotten. Blockchains don't have any right to be forgotten. In fact, you can't forget. In fact, that's the way blockchains must work. You can't forget. And we don't want, it turns out, transparency either. We don't want that data, medical data, to be in public somewhere where anybody can look at it. Think of it this way. Think of it in terms of what we call in cybersecurity attack surface. If you have one server that has a database, you have to break that one server. If you have 1,000 of them, is that easier? Oh yeah. Your attack surface is 1,000 times larger. So the chance you're going to get hacked is 1,000 times bigger. So we don't want the transparency thing, and we don't really want the distributed storage aside from the availability issue of what happens if one server goes down. And finally, I would claim that we don't want anonymity. We probably shouldn't be doing business with people who we don't know and have no reason to trust. If you're doing business with a 256-bit number that represents an account that there might be a person behind, questionable whether you want to trust them or not. So that's not to say that blockchains have no purpose. It's to say that they're young. We don't have good use cases for them aside from currencies, cryptocurrencies. Actually, the professor at Harvard I know describes it differently. He says blockchains really boil down to currency speculation and nefarious purposes. I won't go that far. But I will say that blockchains are not the thing you should count on yet because they're not mature enough. Go back to part 1 of my talk. We don't know enough about them. We haven't tested them enough to understand them, to know how they work, to know they're right, to know what applications they're good at. Okay. So let me say, here's a quote that was actually made by a pundit on the internet about blockchains for health systems. I want to see if you can help me deconstruct this. Blockchain could help pull together a lifetime of transactions from many health systems, pharmacies, health plans, process it into a readable form for patients' use, and convert it to be used by a variety of record systems. And then this information can be managed by the patient or whoever they designate. Okay. Well, first of all, it's the health systems and the pharmacies and the health plans who have to do all the extra work to do these pulling together. It's not the blockchain. There's nothing magical about the blockchain. Those organizations still have to take all their records and send them to this place in the internet. The second thing is that it's external apps, not the blockchain, that's going to do this processing into readable form. Some company has to develop that technology and enable it, just like they would if they were using a database, not a blockchain. That's not really a blockchain function. And the whole idea about being managed by the patient, well, let me know how that works out for you. Not so good. So the real problem here, though, is the following. A technology blockchains, can't solve the bigger issue of agreement and interoperability. That stuff has to be resolved by willingness to do it, figuring out how it's going to happen, architecting a solution, and then and only then choosing the technologies that can make that solution real. You don't start with a technology and force feed it up the chain to try to make it work. That's a really bad idea that software engineers, it turns out, are really good at. Okay, so again, it's not to say that blockchains don't have usefulness. They have limited use. There may be more use that we don't know about yet, but they're not in a state where we should look to them as some kind of black magic or some kind of ring of power. Let me talk about one other technology, and this is something that you may have heard a bit about. It's called secure computation. It seems maybe odd to say that on the one hand, cryptography prevents us from seeing data, but on the other hand to say that, well, we can actually compute on that data while it stays encrypted. That's strange. But as strange as it sounds, that's actually true. So secure computation comes in many forms. I won't go into details here, but it's of the form you can have an encrypted data and there are certain functions that you can compute over that data and learn things about the data without ever seeing it. So, interesting idea. It may turn into something that's good for sharing data while keeping it private. We have many prototypes that run in this space today. The keyword being prototype. They're very slow, so not efficient. They're not proven. We don't have formal verification, mathematical proofs of their correctness yet and their security yet. And they're still, in some sense, a research investigation project. So these things may come up in the future. They may even be part of the Forward Act, the Valley Fever Act. But you should think about those the same way I've been talking here about blockchains. They're not proven yet. They're interesting artifacts that might be useful someday and may help us solve this sharing or retaining privacy problem. Okay, so let's recap. I'm about out of time. Here's my talk in one slide. 1, software engineers are not naturally inclined to assure information security. 2, information security risks in healthcare are growing exponentially, largely because electronic medical records are becoming commonplace. 3, stolen medical records are big business, and the way the data is misused is pretty worrisome. 4, you should take whatever steps you can, that 6-point list I gave you, for example, to safeguard your own ways to access sensitive data so no one else can covertly assume those ways and steal the data. 5, it makes sense to let your providers, where you don't control the data directly, know that you care about information security and that you know the right kind of questions to ask. 6, security technology continues to evolve. Blockchain, secure computation, other forms of cryptography. But C.1, it takes a long time to get it right, and we have to really motivate software engineers to get it right and not to try to sprinkle security on after the fact. And 7, don't expect a technology to solve a bigger, more abstract problem further up the chain. Finally, that ring of power in your vest pocket, just don't. Now, that said, I'm going to borrow heavily to boil my talk down to one specific comic strip. If you don't have this comic strip on your door, you might want to. You'll have to substitute a couple of words in a couple of places, maybe, but it applies almost regardless of the application. Thanks to XKCD for this fabulous comic that talks about, in this case, computerized voting, rather. And software engineers ought to rightly think that that's terrifying. But the last frame says it all. And blockchain you can substitute for other technologies that aren't proven yet. And that's the talk. I'd love to take questions if you have any.
So, let me turn this.
Don't think, yeah, there you go.
So, David, if I'm impressed by the problems with blockchain, like the amount of energy it takes to run it and things we've talked about. Why is there a blockchain caucus in Congress?
So there are many small caucuses in Congress. In the case of the blockchain caucus, I think there are about 20 representatives and senators involved. they believe that there's an economic win to be had. There's a technology there that is promising. Bitcoin has shown that it's popular, it's making money. This could be an economic stimulus to the country. It might provide jobs. So they're interested in technologies like that are promising that way. So they're interested in pushing forward, specifically, in my understanding and talking to the representative directly, uses for blockchain that aren't limited to cryptocurrency. They want to see, is there mileage there in this kind of technology that can create a revolution in technology for security or for availability of information without it being tied solely to cryptocurrencies.
Other questions?
What is the perspective of Epic or Cerner or other EMR vendors on the economics for them if the blockchain technology is developed? Do they get undercut, and are they going to somehow not push back against it necessarily?
So that's a very good question. I mean, I think you'd ultimately have to ask them because I don't have any engagement with those folks. But I can give you a couple of insights from other kinds of emplaced technology companies when revolutionary technology comes along. Some will adapt. They'll buy in early. Some banks are already buying into blockchain technology, not necessarily for cryptocurrency purposes, but for other reasons. They're in there early, investing. They're not particularly pushing back, but what they're doing is adopting and seeing what's it there for. Can we use it? So that's the kind of company you'd like to be engaged with, the ones that are going to engage and evaluate and try to find a use and ultimately give you a reasoned description of yes or no, it's useful, it's not useful. Some will probably do the opposite. They will push back. Historically, when organizations push back against a technology wave, even if it's a highly hyped wave like it is in blockchain, they tend to get washed out. They tend to get pushed over. It's a terrible thing to have happen, and I'm not saying it will happen in this case, but often and historically, new technologies tend to leave in their wake some destruction, right, of people who weren't the adopters. I hope that doesn't happen here because I think blockchains are not ready to be forcing those kinds of decisions yet on people, right? It's too early for that, way too early.
Joe.
So I agree completely with you that software engineers just talk to each other and they never talk to the users. The perfect example of that, of course, is each additional edition of Windows. They change where everything is, but it's absolutely no better than Windows 6 or 5.
That's true.
It's just everything has to be changed, and I'm sure it's economic because they want to sell another thing. But we have a real problem with the EMR. It has made life miserable for doctors. You probably have heard doctors are committing suicide, doctors are quitting because of the EMR, because the software engineers are doing it without talking to the doctors. So how do we pound their heads against the wall to have us included in planning these things instead of saying, oh, this is so cool? You know, I was a chief of cardiology at UMass for a while, and we had a company called E4M that was a recording company.
Right.
We were a beta test site, and the engineers would come up to me all the time and say, "You won't believe this cool thing here. We multiply this, divide this, and then we have this great index." And I would say, "What do we do with it?" "Yeah, well, I don't care. It's just so cool."
Right.
Well, I mean, I think that goes on constantly, and we see it in what I call the evil Cerna, as opposed to the evil Epic. It markedly delays, our ability to give health care. It asks for all kinds of foolish information that, of course, is only used for billing but doesn't help with patient care. How do we influence this?
So this is the master problem, the $50,000 question, because the software industry is all built around ship this thing fast, scale it big, right? If I can scale it big and ship it fast, people will just buy it. And what it does, well, the end users don't have any influence in the decision process, so why do I care what it does? And that's the key. The extent to which the end user has influence on what the organization they work for buys, that's where you get it, right? That's where you can break in and say, no, frankly, don't buy that one because we tried it and it's terrible, right? So that's more of a political question than a technological question, right? It's the organizational politics. You've got to master to be able to get that influence at the board level to say, no, we're not buying anything until my end users say that's the one they want. And if you want to sell to me, You will put your developers on site with my users, have them follow them around for weeks, and then you can come up with a requirements document, and then you can have my users review it, and then we'll pay you to develop it. You have to change that whole model, and the only way is from it's in some sense it's like you could claim the opioid problem is it's a demand side problem. If you let that demand exist, you're going to keep seeing the same behaviors.
When we had Epic, there were lots of problems in the beginning, and I suggested to the person who was in charge of Epic here, let's put together a users committee and we'll
Right.
make some suggestions for you. That was like talking to the wall.
Yep, and that's going to continue. You have to tie your input to purchasing power.
Yeah.
It's the only way to do it.
And I think on that very optimistic note, I would like to thank David again for a very delightful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much.